I can pledge to you that Bill Miller and I will launch that attack. We will first use all of our power and influence to see that law enforcement officers on the state and local level get back the power and the respect they need to carry out their job. And let me here and now make this crystal clear. Enforcement of the law is a state and local responsibility. There is no room in this country for a federal police force, and there's no need for one either. But there's urgent need to return to state and local authorities the traditional powers to apprehend and punish criminals. Powers that have only recently been taken away from those authorities by federal courts, particularly the Supreme Court. Now, as I understand it, the Supreme Court has been given only very limited power over state criminal convictions under our Constitution. In order to reverse a judgment of a state court, it must first determine conclusively that a convicted defendant was denied some specific right guaranteed by the Constitution. Now, that wasn't any problem up until a few years ago. But then the Supreme Court began stretching two phrases in the 14th Amendment, often by a 5-4 decision, until the state courts lost virtually all their powers over judicial process. The result has been severe restriction of state administration of criminal law. Restriction so severe that 36 of the chief justices of our states joined in calling upon the Supreme Court to exercise restraint. Let me just recall some of these key decisions. 3 years ago, 5 members of the Supreme Court decided that state courts must follow federal rules of evidence whether they wanted to or not. Specifically, no evidence could be used if police investigators made some mistake, any mistake in gathering the evidence. Now, this rule must hold even if it means an obviously guilty defendant will go free. It's a rule squarely contrary to common law and to constitutional law, up to 3 years ago. As one of our greatest common law judges once said, such a rule means that the criminal is to go free because the constable has blundered. In an earlier case, the Supreme Court ordered that a criminal conviction should be reversed, no matter how guilty the defendant, if it were shown that some technical violation of constitutional rights occurred anywhere in the course of investigation and trial. If there's any flaw in one confession, all confessions, whether challenged or not, must be thrown out. Now, the trend has now reached its logical end. 5 justices of our Supreme Court have held that a voluntary confession made by a state prisoner was inadmissible because his lawyer was not present when it was made. This was held despite the fact that the prisoner admittedly knew of his right to remain silent. Now, let me, if I can, make this absolutely clear. There was no question in these cases that confessions were extorted or untrue. Such confessions have long and rightly been held invalid. This is a new rule. It seems to say that a criminal defendant must be given a sporting chance to go free, even though nobody doubts in the slightest that he's guilty. No wonder our law enforcement officers have been demoralized and rendered ineffective in their jobs. In fact, and third, the President should urge Congress to consider changing some of the rules of judicial procedure in the federal courts. Congress clearly has this power under the Constitution. I have in mind rules such as the one recently established in a case involving the criminal law of the District of Columbia. That rule, set in the so-called Mallory case, holds that any statement made by a defendant to police officers is inadmissible if arraignment is delayed. It makes no difference whether the delay had any connection with the statement or not. And let me say that within 5 years after this ruling, the robbery rate in the District of Columbia increased by 115%. Our nation's capital now ranks third out of 16 comparable cities in robberies, a place of shame and dishonor that reflects directly on lack of leadership and concern in the White House. These three proposals are constructive steps in the direction of sounder law enforcement, but they can be advanced only under the right leadership. To restore public virtue and thereby law and order, there is no place for the dealership of a clever compromiser, a scheming wire puller, a master politician. There is instead urgent need for leadership dedicated to the principle that moral law binds both the high and the low, that public law must and shall be enforced. With your help, and God's blessing, Bill Miller and I will give you that leadership. This is our solemn pledge. And as we travel down the campaign trail in the coming 7 weeks, because 7 weeks from tonight is the evening of Election Day,